Just one last time a reminder, this coming Friday is the exam. You need to be here at regular time. We'll start right at 1. So be here on Friday for the exam. And once again, reminder that if you miss Friday and you don't have an excuse, if it's not an excused absence with documentation, there's that big old 25% penalty for missing the exam. So don't let that hit you. So that's, make sure that you're here on Friday, basically. And then you do have the study guide and the other documents on the Google Classroom. Make sure that you fit those. There's the practice test and whatnot. And then the study guide. So get those things. So we're starting with Exodus chapter 40 today. Or not Exodus, Genesis chapter 40. I'm apparently really ready to be done with Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 40 today. We left off last time with Joseph having been sold into slavery by his brothers. They sold him into Egypt as a slave. And then once he was in Egypt, he'd been bought by Potiphar, the captain of the guard to Pharaoh, the kind of personal bodyguard to Pharaoh. And he was brought into Potiphar's house, and Potiphar realized or recognized a whole lot of potential in Joseph and pretty quickly elevated him to be kind of the chief steward over his entire household. And so Joseph is now responsible for running everything in Potiphar's house. But he catches the notice of Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar tries to seduce him, and when that fails, she ends up falsely accusing him of rape, and Joseph gets thrown into prison. And so we ended last time with him being in jail, in prison. And so here he is, he's in prison, and a kind of unknown amount of time passes. The first phrase in Genesis chapter 40 is sometime later. Could have been a few months, could have been a few years that Joseph spent in prison before the next piece of the story happens. But sometime later, 2 other fairly significant officials, not quite as big as the captain of the guard, but fairly significant officials in Pharaoh's household or Pharaoh's court are also thrown into prison. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker are both put in prison with Joseph. And in fact, the captain of the guard, Potiphar, gives these 2 men, these 2 officials, to Joseph specifically to take care of. And during this time, before this point, Joseph has been thrown into prison, and it turns out the same thing that happened to him in Potiphar's house happens to him there in prison. The warden over the prison recognizes that Joseph has a lot of administrative gifts and is pretty good at taking care of things, and so he just slowly gives Joseph more and more responsibility until Joseph is basically taking care of the entire prison, and the warden doesn't really have to do anything around that. He doesn't even concern himself with the things that Joseph takes care of because Joseph is so good at doing it. And so Joseph is he's been elevated to, I guess, chief prisoner, which doesn't sound like all that high a position, but it's the highest he can get in his current situation. And there, as the warden has entrusted him with everything, Potiphar comes back, captain of the guard, and he's bringing the cupbearer and the baker to put in jail into this prison, and he entrusts them to Joseph and tells Joseph to take special care of them. Again, this is kind of a hint or kind of another piece of evidence that suggests that Potiphar didn't really believe his wife's accusation of rape, and so he still trusts Joseph enough to give him charge over these 2 important prisoners, despite the fact that Joseph has been accused of raping his wife. And so it kind of looks like Potiphar doesn't really think that Joseph attempted to rape his wife, but had to do something anyway because that's the culture that they lived in. He couldn't take the word of a slave over the word of his wife. And so the cupbearer and baker have been put in prison, and now they're under Joseph's care. And baker you probably get, right? Everybody kind of knows what a baker is. Cupbearer may be less familiar. So the role of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker was to take care of the food and drink in Pharaoh's household. For the baker specifically, all the baked goods, the baked food. The cupbearer's role was to make sure that the king always had wine and to keep stores of it, keep it in stock, what the king wanted, and also to make sure that it was never contaminated, that nobody could poison it and use that as a way to get at the king, to poison the wine and kill the king that way. And so often the cupbearer's role or job would be to taste the wine before giving the cup to the king, and if the cupbearer didn't die, then the king could safely drink the wine. Right? And so the cupbearer would kind of put his life before the king's life and risk his life on the drink before giving it to the king. And so if the wine was poisoned, it was his life first. And so the cupbearer was somebody that stayed pretty close to the king. They weren't given like this massive role over the entire country, but they were still very important to the king, and they were always right there close by. Anytime the king wanted something to drink, he turned to the cupbearer. And so it was somebody that had fairly close access to the king while not having just a slew of authority over the kingdom. And it's kind of the same thing for the baker. The baker was responsible for making sure that the food that was being brought in wasn't contaminated, wasn't poisoned, and so they didn't have this huge authority over the entire kingdom, but they did this important thing that kept the king safe. And so they were both fairly important officials, but they didn't have just this massive amount of authority. And so they were both put in prison because the text says the king was displeased with them. That's all the description we get. We aren't told what they did or what specifically was the issue. My guess is, since both of them had to do with food, and this is my guess or my interpretation, is that because both of them had to do with food and drink and the potential for poisoning, there may have been an assassination attempt on the king, and it wasn't clear which, if either of them was involved, and so the king imprisoned both of them. And so they're there in prison, and Joseph is caring for them, taking care of them, and then one day he is looking at them, he's paying attention to them, he's taking care of them, making sure their needs are met, and one day he notices that they don't look so good. In fact, they look really just kind of brokenhearted or downcast or very troubled by something. Their countenance, their face shows that they're very upset. And so he asks them, what's going on? Why do you look so upset today? And it turns out both the cupbearer and the baker had a dream overnight, and they both realized that the dream is kind of significant and important, but they don't know what it means. And so they're troubled by it. They don't understand what it meant, but they're worried about what it could possibly mean. And so they both say, we both had a dream and we don't know what it means. Now remember from Monday, the beginning of Joseph's story, Joseph is at least partially hated. One of the reasons that Joseph is hated by his brothers is that he had these dreams, and everybody kind of knew what they meant. He had this dream of all the sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf of grain, and brothers, everybody interpreted that as the brothers were going to bow to Joseph one day, and then the sun and moon and stars were all bowing down to him, and that was, that his parents and his brothers were going to bow down to him. And so he's already got this kind of association with dreaming from his early life, but it's gotten him in trouble then. So he hears, they say, the cupbearer and the baker say, we've had these dreams and we don't know what they mean, they're disturbing us. And Joseph replies, says, well, dreams belong to God and their interpretation belongs to God, but if you tell me, I might be able to tell you what they mean. God may tell me what they mean to tell you. So tell me your dreams. And the cupbearer steps up and starts telling about his dream. He says, in my dream, I had the dream, and in the dream I was holding Pharaoh's cups, or his goblet, his cup, and there were these 3 bunches of grapes, and I squeezed the bunches of grapes and drained them into the cup, and then put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And then I woke up. And Joseph says, well, here's what your dream means. The 3 bunches of grapes are 3 days. And so 3 days from now, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head and restore you to your former position. And that lift up your head is a euphemism for encourage you. If you're sad and you're depressed, you kind of turn your face to the ground. But when you're happier, you look up and you look out, right? So you lift up your head when you're happier. And so he says, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put the cup in Pharaoh's hand again. And then he says, when this happens, when you're restored to your position, speak well of me to Pharaoh. Don't forget me. Remember me before Pharaoh, because I was forced into slavery and sold as a slave into Egypt against my will, and then I'm here in this prison. I'm falsely accused. I'm an innocent man in prison for something I didn't do. So speak well of me to Pharaoh. Remember me before Pharaoh, and get me out of here, basically. And so then once the baker hears that the cupbearer got this really good news, he comes and says, well, here's my dream. And so he starts explaining his dream to Joseph. In his dream, he saw himself with 3 baskets of bread. He's the baker, right? 3 baskets of bread, and they're stacked. He's got these baskets stacked on top of his head. And there are these birds, these ravens, that are coming and landing on the top basket and eating the bread out of it. And Joseph says, well, the 3 baskets are 3 days, but that's where the similarities end. So your 3 baskets are 3 days, and in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift off your head and impale you on a pole. He tells the cupbearer, Pharaoh's going to lift up your head. The baker, he says he's going to lift off your head. It's a nice little turn of phrase there, but it's basically, you're going to die. He says he's going to lift off your head and then impale you on a pole. Impaling him on a pole, that you're going to see that happen several times actually in the Old Testament. Before the Romans invented crucifixion, this was kind of impaling somebody on a pole was the pre-crucifixion way to torture somebody to death. The Romans figured out that if you crucified somebody, you nailed them to a post, they actually died slower and more painfully than if you just rammed a pole through them. People died more quickly from being impaled than they did from being crucified, and so the Romans came up with crucifixion. And so he says, Pharaoh's going to lift off your head and then impale you on a pole. And then the story continues, and we're told that everything happened exactly the way Joseph said it would. In 3 days later, the cupbearer was taken out of prison and restored to his rightful place. He was restored to the role of cupbearer, and he was again putting the goblet in the king's hand. And the baker was taken out of prison and impaled on a pole, killed. Whether this was because Pharaoh figured out who was responsible for the assassination attempt, if there ever was an assassination attempt, we don't know. Just note that everything turned out the way that Joseph said, and the cupbearer was restored, and the baker was killed. But the chapter ends, the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. And he went back about, to his life, before prison, and just forgot all about Joseph. And 2 full years passed before the next part of the story happens. And so Joseph is just kind of left in prison, not knowing what the outcome is going to be, knowing that he's innocent. He's left there for another 2 years after the cupbearer and the baker leave. And we don't know how long he was in the prison before that, just sometime later. But 2 years pass, and then in Genesis 41, 2 full years pass, and then Pharaoh has a dream. And he has a kind of a bigger, more complex dream. And he wakes up in the morning and he doesn't know what it means. He's very disturbed by it. And so he gathers up all of his officials and all of his advisors and all the magicians and magi that advise him. And he tells them the dream, and he asks them to tell him what it means. And none of them can tell him what it means. None of them can interpret it. They're all thrown by it. But the cupbearer hears that Pharaoh's had a dream and has all this kind of weird stuff in it. And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes off, and now he remembers Joseph. And so then he tells Pharaoh about this man that was in prison with him, that was over all the prisoners. And he had told him the dream, and the baker had told him his dream, and everything happened exactly the way that he said it would 3 days before it all happened. And so Pharaoh hears that there's this guy that can interpret dreams, and then that they have definitely come true. His interpretations have been proven before. And so he says, go and get this guy and bring him to me. And so they go into the prison. The captain of the guard comes, Potiphar comes and takes Joseph out of prison and takes him and gives him a bath, has him bathed and dressed in clothes fit to appear before the king. And Joseph comes in and is brought before the king, before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, I've had this dream and I've heard that you can interpret. And Joseph, once again, doesn't claim credit for his interpretation. He says, interpretation belongs to God, but if you'll tell me your dream, then maybe God can tell me what it means, or God will show me what it means. And so Pharaoh starts to describe this dream to him. And in this dream, Pharaoh has that he sees these 7 fat, healthy, good-looking cows. There's these 7 cows that just look like they have eaten on the best. They're extremely healthy, they're fat, they're sleek, and they're going down to the Nile River for a drink. And when they get down to the river for a drink, there's these 7 skinny, starved-looking cows that jump up out of the water and eat the 7 healthy cows. And so the 7 fat cows eat the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat, healthy-looking cows, and then the dream switches or ends, and Pharaoh has a second dream. And in the second dream, there's this stalk of wheat that has these 7 heads of grain on it. There's 7 big, fat, healthy-looking, abundant heads of grain. And then all of a sudden there is this other stalk that comes up that looks like it has been scorched by the wind. The heads of grain on it, there's 7 heads of grain on it as well. But these 7 heads of grain are all shriveled and gnarly and diseased looking, and it's like you couldn't grind this and get a loaf of bread out of it. It's basically useless. And the second 7 heads of grain devour the first healthy looking heads of grain. That's all that's left of these 7 blighted, diseased looking grain. And then he wakes up. And so Pharaoh explains these dreams to Joseph, these 2 dreams. And Joseph says, your 2 dreams are actually one dream. They both have the same meaning, and God has given it to you twice so that you will know for sure that he's going to do this. This is, God has given it to you twice to make really sure that you know he's committed. This is going to happen. And the 7 big fat cows and the 7 very healthy looking heads of grain are 7 years. And so for the next 7 years, there's going to be this abundant harvest. The food will be abundantly available in Egypt. Everybody will have plenty. All the farmland will produce this bumper, amazing crop. Animals will grow and be very healthy. There will be an incredible bounty in Egypt for the next 7 years. But then after that, the 7 skinny, diseased-looking cows and the 7 diseased-looking heads of grain are going to eat up everything. There's 7 more years coming after that of intense famine. And those 7 years of famine are going to devour everything that this first 7 years could give. And so you're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of intense famine. And so here's what you should do. Here's what the king should do. Appoint officers over Egypt to build storage barns, build big barns, and to collect 1/5 of everything that's produced during the 7 years of plenty and store it and save it so that there'll be enough to survive through the 7 years of famine that are coming. And so put officials over all of Egypt to collect all of this grain, all of the abundance, the 1/5 of all of this abundance during the years of plenty, so that there will be something to eat during the years of famine that are coming after. And Pharaoh hears the interpretation, and he hears Joseph's explanation and his recommendations for what to do about it. And he looks around at his officials and says, well, who among us has this kind of wisdom and is touched with this wisdom of God and is filled with the Spirit of God? Here's the man for the job. And so immediately he hears the interpretation, hears the suggestion, and he immediately takes Joseph and elevates him and makes him second in command over all of Egypt. And he says, not only does he give Joseph authority over the food collection and making sure that the food it gets collected during 7 years of plenty, he says, you are over all of Egypt. And in fact, no one in Egypt will lift a hand or a foot except at your word, and except only with respect to the throne will you be less than me. Will I be greater than you? And so he gives him authority over all of Egypt except for himself, and takes his signet ring off of his finger and puts it on Joseph's hand as a sign of his personal authority, and then rides him around in a chariot. And then he gives Joseph a new name, or an Egyptian name, calls him Zaphenath-Paneah. Make sure you can spell that right for the exam. I'm kidding. I'm not going to put that on the exam. But he gives him this Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and arranges a marriage with the daughter of an important priest in Egypt, the priest of On. And so he arranges this marriage for him, and Joseph, during the 7 years of plenty, he builds up these great big barns, he collects his food, brings it all in, and the text says that there was so much collected during this time, that there was so much surplus, that Joseph had to give up counting it. He had to give up keeping a record of how much there was. It was too laborious to accurately count and keep up with how much was being brought in. But they stuffed these huge barns, built these huge facilities, and they stuffed these barns full of the abundance and the leftover grain, the surplus from the years of plenty, to prepare for the years of famine. And during this 7 years of plenty, while after Joseph is married to the daughter of the priest of On, he has 2 sons. Names are Manasseh and Ephraim. And with this, you now have all the names you need to get the names of the tribes of Israel. Because you've got the names of Joseph's 12 sons, but I told you the other day that Joseph doesn't have a tribe named after him. Instead, it's his 2 sons. They have tribes named after them. And so you have the 12 sons of Jacob. If you cross out Joseph's name from that list and add these 2 names instead, you have now the full list of the names of the tribes of Israel. So that's you will need to know Manasseh and Ephraim, and know that they are Joseph's sons. And then as we get into Exodus and beyond, once we start Exodus, the next book, all of these names of the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 11 sons of Jacob other than Joseph, and then Manasseh and Ephraim, you're going to keep running into those names because they are the names of the major divisions of the nation of Israel, the people. And so you'll need to know the names of the tribes of Israel as we go. And so that's you'll need to know the names of the 12 sons of Jacob and Manasseh and Ephraim. And so everything is going really well. The 7 years of collection is so abundant that nobody can even keep track of it anymore. There's just this huge amount of food being stored. But then in the 7th year, after the 7th year, the abundance stops and the drought sets in. And there's this massive drought, and that leads to nothing being able to grow. There's no food available, and none is growing from the ground. And so now everybody has to come to Pharaoh to buy grain, to buy food. And so during this time, Pharaoh has been buying a fifth of the surplus. It was really cheap then because there was just an insane amount of food. And so he's been buying a fifth of it from everybody. Everybody's been flush with money, but now the abundance has stopped. The famine is setting in, and now everybody has to come to Pharaoh to buy food. And it turns out that it's not just Egypt that is struggling with this famine and this drought. It's actually very widespread. And at least Egypt and Canaan are involved, the land that Jacob lives in and that all of Joseph's brothers are living in. But actually, I ran just kind of randomly last week. I knew this lecture was coming, but randomly last week I ran into this article in Nature, which is a scholarly journal for various scientific disciplines, natural sciences kind of thing. And so it's very respected journal. This was on their website. It was more of a popular article than a scholarly article, but still the same source. But it was talking about this potentially worldwide drought that struck in about 2200 BC. That it at least affected all of the Mediterranean area, which would be kind of southern Europe, what we now think of as the western part of the Middle East, what we think of as the Middle East, and then the northern part of Africa, and then several places, stretched further out, including like some places in China. There's archaeological evidence, this particular strata of rock layer that shows a significant drought around 2200 BC, and that may have led to several different kind of sociological shifts and nations having to change as a result. And so it's kind of cool that just last week I ran into some pretty significant archaeological historical evidence for this famine. But the famine sets in, and it doesn't just affect Egypt, it affects wide area, including the area that Jacob and his other sons live in, the rest of Joseph's family. And so Joseph is now, he's exalted as the second in command over all of Egypt, and he has collected all this food, and now he is in charge of making sure that the food is distributed and that Pharaoh gets paid back, that he gets paid for it. And so somehow it gets around, it becomes known that Egypt still has food. And so Jacob tells his sons, the remaining sons in Canaan, tells them to go to Egypt and to take money and to buy some grain, buy some food. But he won't let Benjamin go with them because he's afraid that something's going to happen to his youngest son, and he's already lost Joseph, the older son, by Rachel, and he can't bear the idea of losing Benjamin too. And so he sends the older 10 brothers to go back and to go to Egypt and try to buy grain. And so the brothers come to Egypt, and they're walking in, and they see Zaphanath-Paneah. But they don't know that it's Joseph. I mean, it's been decades at this point, at least 15, 18 years, maybe more than 20 years since they've seen Joseph, since they pulled him out of a pit to sell him into slavery. He was still really young then, and so he's changed a lot, and the method of dress in Egypt is very different than they're used to, and so he looks different because of how he's dressed than he normally would. And they're just not expecting to see the second in command of all of Egypt be their brother, and they could probably think that he's dead or who knows where now. He was sold into slavery, somewhere towards Egypt. And so they're really not expecting to see Joseph, and so they don't recognize him. They see Zaphanath-Paneah, second in command over all of Egypt. And Joseph, he recognizes his brothers, but he never speaks to them in Hebrew, or he doesn't speak to them in their language. He always speaks to them in Egyptian with an interpreter. And so they don't recognize him. They have no idea who they're talking to. And so they come up to speak to him, to buy grain, to save their family from starvation, and so they bow to him. as just part of the greeting of somebody that's in a position of authority over them. So they bow to their brother, and Joseph remembers the dream. That first dream that he had when those 11 sheaves of grain bowed to his sheaf of grain. And he remembers the dream and remembers what it meant and that it has happened. It just happened. His brothers bowed to him. And then, he's talking to them. The brothers say that they want to buy grain to take back to their starving families. And Joseph, I'm not sure why he does what he does or what his motivation is, whether he's still angry at his brothers because of selling him into slavery, or he wants to test them and see what they're made of now, if they've changed, or they're exactly who they used to be, or if he's just an impish little brother and wants to mess with them now that he has the power. I don't know what his motivation is, but instead of answering them back and selling them the grain like they want, or telling them who he is, revealing himself and giving them the good news, he messes with them. He accuses them of being a spy, being a group of spies. He says, you aren't here just to buy grain. You're here to check out and see where we might be weak so that you can attack and steal food for yourself. And you are here to spy out the land and see where we're weak so that you'll know where to attack. You're not just a group of brothers, you're spies. And the brothers now are kind of freaking out because this really powerful man in Egypt is accusing them of being spies, and he has control over the food that they desperately need to take home to their family. And so they start begging and pleading, saying, no, we're not spies. We're a group of 10 brothers. And so they start getting questioned, and Joseph is questioning them, and he drags out of them details about their family. Of course, he knows what he asks them, but he drags all these details out of them about their aged father that still is back in Canaan, and that he has a younger brother, that there's one more brother that isn't there, the youngest, and that there was another brother, but he is no more, as they say it in the text, that there was another brother, but he is no more. And so it drags, gets all these details out of them. He says, you are spies. He just says, you are spies, and here's how we're going to prove that you're spies. I don't think your little brother that you talk about, I don't think he exists. And so I'm going to put all of you in prison, except for one, and one of you can go back. And if you bring back your little brother and prove to me that you have this little brother you talk about, then I'll know you're not spies, and I'll let the rest of you go. But otherwise, you're spies. And so he puts them in prison, and leaves them there for 3 days. He puts his brothers in prison and leaves them there for 3 days. And then at the end of the 3 days, he comes back to them and says, you know what? I'm a generous man, I fear God. I'm going to let all but one of you go and carry back food for your families because you're worried about them starving. So I'll sell you the food, and you can carry it back, but one of you will remain here, and I won't release that brother, and you will never be able to speak to me again. You'll never be able to buy grain again. You'll never see my face again unless you come back with this other brother that you claim to have. And so he takes Simeon, one of the second eldest, and puts him in chains and carries him off to prison, back into prison, and then lets the rest of the brothers go and sells them the grain, fills their sacks with grain and sends them back on the way. And the brothers are all kind of messed up about this. They're freaked out about it. They're leaving their brother behind, and now they have to bring the other brother back, and they know dad's never going to go for that. And it's like this. It's kind of a nightmare situation. And they get to the end of the travel for the day, and they're kind of setting up camp to spend the night before they finish the trip the next day. And as they open up the sacks to get out some grain for the animals to eat, they find that the sacks have all of their money in it. All of the brothers' money is back in the mouth of their sacks. It's like as though they stole it. And so now they're doubly freaked out, because if we go back now, then they're going to think that we tried to steal all this money, and we have no idea how this got here. What in the world is going on? Why is God doing this to us? And so they come back, they go all the way back to Jacob. They explain to him everything that's happened, and Jacob just basically writes off Simeon. It's like, now 2 of my sons are no more. Like, no, he's just in prison in Egypt, and the guy said if we bring Benjamin, he'll let him go. It's like, nope, we are not sending Benjamin. I'm not risking his life. Simeon is just no more. Simeon is gone. This, again, Jacob's kind of favoritism for his sons by Rachel. It's now fallen on Benjamin instead of Joseph. And so Simeon is just, no more. We're not risking Benjamin. Well, the year plays out. They eat through all the food that they bought, and the next year is no better. And the food runs out, and Jacob calls the sons in again and says, go back to Egypt and buy more food, or we're going to starve. And the brothers say, we can't unless we bring Benjamin with us. The man told us very plainly, we will not see him again unless we bring our brother with us. And Jacob says, no, you're not taking Benjamin. If you take Benjamin and you don't bring him back, he will die on the trip. Something will go wrong. And if he doesn't come back home, I'll die of grief. You will bring your father's head to the grave in grief, in misery. And Judah speaks up and says, look, if we don't go, we're all going to die of starvation anyway. So if I don't, I'll take personal responsibility for Benjamin. And if I don't bring him home, then you can blame me for the rest of my life. You can say it was all me. And in fact, at one point he even says, you can even kill my 2 sons if that would make you feel better. And finally, Jacob, once it sinks into his head that if they don't get the food, then Benjamin's going to die anyway. They're all going to die anyway. He finally says, okay, fine, go, take Benjamin, and if I die, I die. If I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved. And so they set off and they go back, and Jacob tells them to take an assortment of gifts for the man. And so they take some of the stuff that has been produced in their area, things that probably aren't as easy to get in Egypt, like myrrh and pistachios, apparently, and honey and a few other things that are just kind of special to their area that they produce. And they bring it back, and he says, take double the money. Basically, take the money that was left in your sack last time, and then more money, and give them back the money that was you came home with somehow, that you accidentally kept. And then buy a grain with the rest. And so they travel back, and they come and they present themselves before Joseph. They bow down before him again. And when he sees that they have brought Benjamin, he's happy. And so he tells his kind of steward, his chief servant, to take them back to his house and to tell the servants there to kill an animal and prepare a feast. And he's going to come and have a meal with them, have this big feast with them. Well, the brothers, they don't speak Egyptian, so they didn't hear all this planning and what he intended. And so they see that they're being taken to a more secluded location and into this man that was harsh with them before, into his private house. And they still have this money that was given back to them, or that they ended up back with last time. And so they think that everybody thinks that they're thieves. And so their conclusion is, this man is taking us into his house to overpower us and either kill us or take us as slaves, and to keep all of our stuff for himself because he thinks we stole from him last time. And so on the way, while they're traveling and getting there, before they get into his house, they turn to the steward and say, look, here's the silver, here's the money that we were supposed to pay last time. We found it back in our sacks. We have no idea how it happened, but we're returning it to you now. So here is the money. And the servant looks at them and says, I don't know what you're talking about. We got your money. Your God must have just given you a treasure. And so refuses to take the money and brings them in and says, but don't be afraid. Don't worry. Come on in. And so brings them in, and they prepare the feast. And then Joseph comes in after whatever work he was doing, doing some more of the distribution before he hands it off to somebody else. He comes in after the feast is ready, and he comes in, and there's all of his brothers there ready for a meal. And when he sees Benjamin there, he kind of has this moment where he's kind of overcome with nostalgia and love for his little brother. And so he has to quickly leave the room and go out and go into his private chambers and weep and cry for a minute before he gets himself under control. And then he comes back in and starts the feast, serves the dinner. And the brothers are kind of freaked out that they're all seated in order by birth, that they've been seated in their birth order. It's like, how does he know what our birth order is? How much does this guy know about us? And then Benjamin, at the end, Benjamin's plate is just heaped over. The text says that he gave him 5 times as much. He gave him 5 portions, 5 times the portion of any of the other brothers. And so there's like this just mound of food in front of Benjamin, the smallest one. I gotta think it's kind of a funny. Everybody else has got a feast portion. It's a big plate. And then down at the end, you got Benjamin just barely peeking over his pile. But it gives him 5 times as much. And they go through the meal, everything goes, it's fine. And Joseph asks questions about their father back home and about this youngest brother that's there with him that they told him about. And he's still playing the game like he has no idea, and they have no clue who he is. And then the meal ends, it's all over, and he tells his steward to give them as much grain as they can carry, to load them up with everything that they can load up and take home. But to put their money back in their sacks again, and to not keep the money, but then also to take his silver cup from his place at the table and sneak it into the youngest son, the youngest brother's bag, into Benjamin's bag, and send them off. And so the servant does what he's told, the steward does what he's told, and then the next morning the brothers get up and they leave, they start traveling to go back home, and Joseph watches them go, and after they've just kind of gotten out of sight, out of view, they've gotten just out of the city, he turns to the steward and says, "Now take some men and go catch them and accuse them of stealing my cup." And so the steward does what he's told. He takes a little force, he goes, chases them down, catches them, and accuses them of stealing the master's cup. It's like, how could you, after the master has been so generous?
Is Simeon with them now?
Yeah, he's given Simeon back to them. And they seem that Simeon was well treated, so Simeon is back with them. They're all going back home. Good question, I forgot to mention. They're all going back home, and he sends the steward after them with this force. And the steward shows up and says, "Why did you steal the master's cup after he was so generous and kind to you? How could you do this?" And the brothers say, "You haven't stolen any cup. What are you talking about? We haven't taken anything that wasn't ours. We would never, violate hospitality that way. Steal from your master. In fact, if you find the cup in anyone's bag, you can kill them or take them as a slave as you wish." People have really got to stop making that promise in the stories, right? It doesn't work out well for them anytime that it happens. But they say, if it's in anyone's bag, you find your master's cup among any of our belongings, you can kill that person or take them as a slave as you wish. And so the steward put the cup in the bag. He knows which bag it's in, I guess just for dramatic effect. He starts with the oldest and goes down the line until he comes to Benjamin's bag and opens up Benjamin's bag, and there's the cup. And when the brothers see the cup getting pulled out of Benjamin's bag, they start panicking, freaking out. They tear their robes, which is a sign of grief in this time period, in this part of the world. And they tear their robes, and they all, instead of just accepting that Benjamin's going to be taken back as a slave, they all load up and they all go back to Egypt. They all go back to Joseph. And then they start throwing themselves on the ground in front of Joseph and begging and pleading not to take their brother, not to harm their brother. And he says, "Just keep us all. If you're going to keep Benjamin, just keep us all as slaves. It'd be better that we all stayed as slaves than to go back without him." And then Judah speaks up and starts saying, this is our little brother. He's so cherished by our father. Our father's life is bound up with his life. If we go home without him, our father will die of grief. And then he says, it would be better to let me stay in the boy's place. Let me become a slave in his place and send him home and save my father's life. It would be better, far better for me to stay in the boy's place than for me to go home and see my father's grief. Well, when Judah offers to take Benjamin's place and become a slave in his place, Joseph cracks, loses his composure. And he has to send all of the Egyptian attendants out, everybody out except for his brothers, and then he starts just breaking down, weeping and crying. And the reason for this, I think, is my interpretation here is, if you look back in the story, you go back a few chapters to the beginning of Joseph's story when he's being sold into slavery by his brothers. It was Reuben, the eldest brother, is the one that suggested that instead of killing him, they should throw him in the pit. And then his plan was to come back later after the brothers were gone and rescue him and carry him back home. But then while he was gone planning that rescue, Judah is the one that sees the caravan and speaks up and says, "Let's sell him. Let's make him a slave. Then we won't have to kill him, and he'll still be out of our hair, and we'll get a little money out of the deal on the side." And so Judah is the one that says, "Sell him as a slave." And now here, at the end of the story, Judah is offering to take Benjamin's place and be a slave rather than to see the same thing happen to Benjamin. And so I think my interpretation here is that Joseph is overcome when he sees the change of heart in Judah and in the rest of his brothers. And so finally here he breaks down and he weeps. He sends all the Egyptians out, and he starts just weeping and crying and wailing and tells the brothers who he is. He says, "It's me, it's Joseph. It's your brother that you sold into slavery." And he says, don't be afraid and don't be angry with yourselves. You intended this for evil. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And through this, God has been able to save many, many lives. All of Egypt and now my family too. So don't be angry with yourselves and don't be afraid. God intended this. This was God's plan. And so then he says, how is my father? And he makes this plan. He says, go back and tell my father what you've seen and get him and all of the household and bring them here so that I can take care of them here in Egypt. And so he tells the brothers to go and get the father. And the Egyptian attendants that were sent out they can overhear a lot of what's going on. They can hear it when they're out of the room. They hear Joseph's wailing and crying, and they understand enough of what's going on to realize that he's telling them to go and that his brothers have come, and that he's saying, go and get your father. And so the word is carried back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh hears what's going on. And I mean, Joseph has basically single-handedly led Egypt through this period of feast and now into famine, and everybody sees that his leadership has saved lives. And so Pharaoh and all the officials are really happy with Joseph. And so they kind of want to do something for him. And so Pharaoh sends a messenger to go back and to tell Joseph and his brothers that they should go and bring the father back and take carts and take horses and chariots, take whatever they need to go back and get everything that belongs to Jacob, all that belongs to Joseph's family, and bring it back. And to don't even worry about bringing your household possessions and your stuff. Whatever you need, we'll provide it once you get here. You'll have the best of whatever we have in Egypt, and we'll give you land to settle in. Just come here and let Joseph take care of you. Let Pharaoh be your sponsor, and come back here. And so the brothers go back and they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive, and not only alive, but in command of all of Egypt. And Benjamin is able, once Benjamin being the younger brother, once he knows that it's Joseph, or is told that it's Joseph, he recognizes him and can reassure his father, Jacob, that it's really Joseph. And so Joseph loads up everything is loaded up, and they all come to Egypt, and they settle in Goshen, this particular region. And Goshen is the area where most of the flocks are kept in Egypt. And there's this historical reason that Egyptians don't like shepherds, that they find shepherds very distasteful. There's some backstory there that we don't have time to go into, but they find shepherds distasteful, but it's a necessary profession. If you're going to have herds, you got to have people to take care of them. And so Pharaoh says, he knows that they are shepherds, and he says, if there's any of your brothers that have any particular skill, make them my chief shepherd, put them in charge over my flocks. And so they're brought in, and they're given this land, and they're given the best of Egypt, and Joseph gets to have his family close by. And this kind of sets the stage for what we're going to see in Exodus, and I'll kind of explain how in just a second. But the 7 years of famine passes, and during that 7 years of famine, remember, people had been selling their excess to Pharaoh all the way along the way, and Joseph has been putting it away, and now people are having to buy back during the time of famine. Well, apparently there was a price difference between the two, or people were really unwise in the way they spent that money, and they didn't have enough money to buy back the grain they needed during the 7 years of famine. And so over the course of that 7 years, people started spending their money to buy back food, and then they ran out of money. And so then they started selling all of their animals and trading off all their animals and all of their other valuables in order to buy food. And pretty soon they ran out of all of that. And by the end of the famine, practically everybody in Egypt had to sell themselves to Pharaoh as a slave and be taken care of just as one of Pharaoh's slaves, one of his servants. And so practically everybody in Egypt by the end of the famine has had to sell themselves into slavery in order to continue eating. And this represents a pretty major balance of power shift in Egypt. Before, you had Pharaoh as a king over people, right? And so the king is a powerful king over a powerful nation. So there's a lot of authority, a lot of control, but he's not this absolute dictator, absolute monarch, absolute control of everyone. But when we think of Egypt, historically, when you think about the history of Egypt, most people remember stories of Pharaoh being this absolute ruler that had total authority over everybody, that could waste the lives of slaves in incredible numbers in order to build the great works of Egypt, and that whatever the Pharaoh said was law. Not only was the Pharaoh this incredibly powerful figure and great powerful king, but he was seen as being divine, either one of the gods or an embodiment of the gods. And so this big shift of power, the big shift of way of thinking about Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's authority in Egypt comes about at least partially because of this famine and everyone having to sell themselves into slavery to Pharaoh in order to continue to eat. And of course, there's other political stuff that happens after that. People aren't really satisfied with being made into slaves in order to eat, and there's rebellions. But ultimately, it all works out so that Pharaoh becomes a much more powerful ruler in Egypt and has much more control over his own people than he ever did before. This also sets the stage for Exodus, that now Joseph has sent for and brought his entire family into Egypt to take care of them. And Genesis is going to end with the death of Jacob and then the death of Joseph. And Jacob is going to ask that, when someday God is going to take our people and lead us out of here and back to the land that he has promised us. And when that day comes, take my bones with you and bury them when you arrive in the promised land. Bury me in the land of my fathers. And so he makes them make that promise, and they do. But there's going to be 400 years that pass between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And in that 400-year period, the population of Israel is going to explode. The number of Hebrews among the Egyptians is going to go from several hundred to 1 million or so, potentially multiple millions. So their population is going to balloon, explode, and enough time is going to pass that people are going to forget about Joseph and forget about the contributions that he made to their society and how they survived because of him and his family. And they're going to see this massive number of people among them that aren't exactly Egyptian, and they're going to start to get very afraid. And so Pharaoh is going to force the Hebrews, the Israelites, into slavery, and that's where we're going to find ourselves at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Instead of being these exalted guests of this great servant, the people of Israel are going to be huge in number, but they're going to be forcibly enslaved, and Pharaoh afraid of them and trying to figure out how to get their numbers down so that they can control them. And that's where we'll pick up in Exodus on Monday. That's it for today, and it for Genesis. I did point out we have finished now the first two major time periods that I mentioned. We have nine time periods in the Old Testament. We finished the primeval history, the creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel, that sequence in Genesis 1 through 11. And now we finished the patriarchal history, the patriarchs being Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it's Jacob's sons that are the fathers of the tribes of Israel. So Jacob ends up being the last guy that's the common ancestor for all of Israel. And so Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are considered the patriarchs. So with that, are there any questions about the exam or what to expect? Or any questions that were on the study guide that any of you looked at that you really didn't understand? All right, well then I'll see you on Friday for the exam. If you show up a few minutes early, you'll be able to ask me questions then too.